This is BBC News. I'm Rebecca Jones. The headlines at 5. Pope Francis is in Ireland for the first papal visit in almost 40 years. He's spoken of his shame at the failure of the Catholic Church to address the abuse of children by priests.
The
failure of ecclesiastical authorities, bishops, religious superiors, priests and others adequately to address these repellent crimes has rightly given rise to outrage and remains a source of pain and shame for the Catholic community. I myself share those sentiments.
In other news, women in England are to be allowed to take the second of 2 early abortion pills in their own homes instead of in a clinic. A Jewish man who believes he was one of the British Zionists who Jeremy Corbyn said didn't understand English irony demands an apology from the Labour leader. Holidaymakers arrive home after being flown back early from an Egyptian hotel following the unexplained deaths of a British couple. Very good afternoon and welcome to BBC News. Pope Francis has addressed the controversy of abuse within the Catholic Church at the start of his historic 2-day visit to Ireland. In a speech at Dublin Castle, the Pope spoke of the pain and shame within the Catholic community over the Church failing to protect the young people in its charge. In the last hour, thousands of people have turned out on the streets of Dublin to witness the first papal visit to Ireland in almost 40 years. Our Ireland correspondent Emma Vardy reports.
Descending on Dublin this morning, Shepherd 1, the papal plane. This is Ireland's first visit from the Pope in 4 decades, and welcoming the head of the Catholic Church has been a much anticipated moment. Ireland was once known as the most Catholic country in the world. But rocked by scandals, the Church has fallen from grace. In Dublin, Pope Francis spoke of the sexual abuse of children by Catholic priests and the failure of the Church to address it.
The failure of ecclesiastical authorities, bishops, religious superiors, priests and others adequately to address these repellent crimes has rightly given rise to outrage and remains a source of pain and shame for the Catholic community. I myself share those sentiments.
Pope Francis will meet with survivors of clerical abuse during his visit. Some say his condemnation of these crimes is not enough.
It has to be zero tolerance, and that means every abusive priest, bishop and those who covered it up be sacked and removed from the church immediately.
Half the population of Ireland turned out to see Pope John Paul in 1979. Back then, homosexuality, contraception and divorce were illegal. Now Ireland is very much changed.
An Ireland that is very different from 1979 when a pope was last among us. An Ireland, I suppose, a bit more divided in terms of social issues, religious issues and so on. But I think everybody will be touched by the warmth of Pope Francis, by his sense of proximity, particularly to vulnerability.
Hey! The Pope is here! There must be some Irish in the air!
The famous Pope-mobile will come through the centre of Dublin this afternoon, and there is certainly a sense of celebration and excitement building here, because despite a decline in the Church's authority, this is still predominantly a Catholic country where the Pope has the power to draw the crowds. His visit also draws protests, with campaigners voicing frustration on issues such as the Church's refusal to ordain female priests.
T-shirts, scarves, flags are
But the feel-good factor of this visit is gaining momentum. For many, the Pope's presence brings hope that confidence in the Church can be renewed. Emma Vardy, BBC News, Dublin.
Well, the Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar has called on Pope Francis to listen to survivors of abuse at the hands of the Church at the start of the Pope's visit to Ireland. Mr Varadkar said the wounds of scandals such as the clerical sexual abuse of children were still open.
In place of Christian charity, forgiveness and compassion, far too often there was judgment, severity and cruelty, in particular towards women and children and those on the margins. Magdalene laundries, mother and baby homes, industrial schools, illegal adoptions and clerical child abuse are stains on our state, our society and also the church. People kept in dark corners, behind closed doors, cries for help that went unheard. And these wounds are still open, and there is much to be done to bring about justice and truth and healing for the victims and survivors. Holy Father, we ask that you use your office and influence to ensure that this is done here in Ireland and also around the world.
Leo Varadkar there. Well, Colm O'Gorman, Executive Director of Amnesty International Ireland, who's a survivor of clerical abuse, told my colleague Anita McVeigh about his campaign, Stand for Truth.
We heard that Francis is on the side of victims. Please show me how. Because right now, following on from the Pennsylvania grand jury report, for instance...
Which we've been talking about today.
Absolutely. His bishops and others are fighting tooth and nail efforts to change the laws there to allow those victims access to justice. If Francis was on the side of victims, he wouldn't be driving down a street in Dublin right now. He would have gotten on a plane to Pennsylvania, kicked open the doors of those bishops, fired them, and instructed those same lawyers not only not to fight access to justice, but to work to secure access to justice for those victims. So we get lots of words, most of which don't mean very much at all, no acknowledgement of responsibility, and no action.
Tell me about Stand for Truth, Colm. Tell me what you're planning for tomorrow.
Well, I mean, tomorrow what we've decided to do and what we really wanted to do was not, you know, have a protest where we asked for something from the Pope. The Pope knows what he needs to do. He's not a foolish man. But rather, we want to come together and stand in the truth of what we know. The fact of what's happened in this country, there isn't a family in this country that hasn't been touched by the abuse perpetrated by members of the church and facilitated by the institutional church. The fact of the cover-up is known. So we're inviting people to come together with us at the Gardens of Remembrance tomorrow and stand in the truth of that. It's a rally for truth, a rally for justice and a rally for love. If the Pope won't do it, that's somewhat irrelevant. We will do it. This is a changed country. This is a country now where no Pope, no bishop can enforce their dogma on the people of this state. So we'll stand for truth and we'll stand in solidarity together.
And I think you're expecting big numbers there.
Yeah, it looks like, I mean, look, when I announced this, it was purely to create a space where people could come together. We now have just incredible artists and performers who are going to come and invoke the kind of energy that we want in the space. And yes, indeed, we're expecting very significant numbers.
Colm O'Gorman there talking about his campaign Stand for Truth. And Pope Francis is due to give a speech later this evening at the Feast of the Families event in Dublin, and we'll bring you that speech live at 8 o'clock here on the BBC News channel, so do of course stay with us for that. In other news, women in England will be allowed to take an early abortion pill at home under a government plan due to take effect by the end of the year. At present, women ending a pregnancy in its first 10 weeks must take 2 pills at a clinic 24 to 48 hours apart. The move will bring England into line with Scotland and Wales. Anna Miller reports.
At the moment in England, women who want to end their pregnancy before 10 weeks have to take 2 pills, up to 48 hours apart and at a clinic. But some people like Zoe have experienced bleeding and cramping on their way home.
It was so traumatic and so unexpected. The pain and the nausea was so extreme that I had to get off the tube. I lay down on a bench and basically just decided that I wasn't going to move any further.
Changes to the law will help minimise the distress. The Department of Health says by the end of the year it will allow women to take the second pill in the familiar surroundings of their own home. But abortion has been legal for many years. Why has the decision happened now?
This tiny change has taken so long because ministers and civil servants, I think, have exaggerated. They have an exaggerated sense of what the opposition to abortion is. Most people, even if they don't like the idea of abortion, recognise that it's legal and it should be allowed as safely as possible.
180,000 women have an abortion each year in England, and 4 out of 5 of those are early medical terminations. The move has been welcomed.
This is a way in which girls and women can access the second part, or the second pills, in their early medical abortion in a safe, effective and compassionate way.
England will fall in line with Wales and Scotland. In Northern Ireland, abortion is still illegal unless there's a serious risk to a woman's health or life. Campaigners say they're ready to make the changes now, and the government's end-of-year deadline couldn't come fast enough. Enna Miller, BBC News.
A Jewish man who believes he was one of the British Zionists who Jeremy Corbyn said didn't understand English irony has told the BBC his comments were deeply anti-Semitic and the Labour leader should apologise. Mr Corbyn has defended comments he made in 2013 when he was a backbencher. He said he was referring to people who support the creation of a Jewish state corresponding to the historic land of Israel and not to all Jews. Well, our political correspondent Tom Barton is here. Tom, I know you've been speaking to this Jewish man. What has he had to say and who is he?
So Richard Millett is a blogger. He writes a blog about anti-Semitism, and in that capacity he regularly attends pro-Palestinian events where he thinks people might use anti-Semitic language in order to observe those events, to record what people are saying, and if he thinks they're saying anything concerning to then report that on his blog. And it's in that capacity that he was at this speech in 2013 by the Palestinian representative to the UK, Manuel Hassassian. Now, in the video you mentioned that emerged a few days ago, Jeremy Corbyn was filmed talking about Zionists who attended that event failing to understand English irony. Now, Mr Millett, who is Jewish, said that that characterisation strongly implied that he was not English, and therefore, despite the fact he'd lived in the UK for his whole life, and therefore that statement, he says, was anti-Semitic.
Why use the term English? Why say I have no sense of English irony? It implies that I'm not English, strongly implies that I'm not English, and that is obviously offensive. Whether he knew I was Jewish, which he does, we mixed in the same circles, or he doesn't know I'm Jewish, it still is aimed, can only have been aimed at someone who was Jewish, because he said, I have no sense of English irony. He didn't just say no irony. So to make a comment that I don't get English irony implies that I'm not from here, not from the United Kingdom, which, to highlight that, I find very offensive. It was unnecessary to do it and racist.
Richard Millett clearly talking to you a little earlier. What's been Labour's response, Tom?
Well, Labour sources point to the statement that Jeremy Corbyn published last night, and I'll just read you a bit of it. It said he defended the Palestinian ambassador in the face of what he thought were deliberate misrepresentations by people for whom English was a first language, when English wasn't the first language of the ambassador. Essentially what they say that means is that he'd said that those at the meeting had failed to understand irony, not because they were Jewish, but despite the fact that they were English. And that, they say, is a different characterisation, a different way of understanding his comments. That hasn't, though, stopped several Labour MPs raising concerns about what he said, including the MP Wes Streeting, who said the language used there was inexcusable and abhorrent, while the Jewish Labour MP Luciana Berger said that the video contained inexcusable comments. And it's worth noting, you know, those two are regular critics of Jeremy Corbyn, but Luciana's tweet received support on Twitter from other MPs, people
Labour
like
MPs,
other Labour MPs, like the Newcastle North MP Catherine McKinnell, the Sedgefield MP Phil Wilson, who aren't kind of well-known, high-profile critics of Jeremy Corbyn. And I think that underlines the concern within some parts of the Labour Party about these comments.
OK, Tom, we'll leave it there for now. Tom Barton, thank you. Workers at the train company Northern have begun a 24-hour strike in a long-running row over driver-only operated trains. People attending major events today, including Manchester Pride, Creamfields and Leeds Festival, were advised to be aware of a reduced service. Northern says it will be operating about 30% of its usual services. The first holidaymakers to be flown home early from the Egyptian hotel where a British couple died have arrived back in the UK. John and Susan Cooper from Burnley were staying at the Steinberger Aquamagic Hotel in Hurghada. Thomas Cook says the circumstances surrounding their deaths remains unclear. Katie Austin reports.
Arriving home, all of Thomas Cook's 300 customers from the Aqua Magic Hotel have now left. Nearly half have flown back to the UK, while others moved hotels.
When you find out at 10:30 at night that 2 people have died 2 days ago and nobody knows why, and they obviously came down ill quite suddenly, haven't had a chance to get a doctor first, then yeah, I'm wondering what's happening to my kids when they're sleeping.
Some people were quite irate of his shame at the failure of the Catholic Church to address the abuse of children by priests. Women in England are to be allowed to take the second of 2 early abortion pills in their own homes instead of in a clinic. A Jewish man who believes he was one of the British Zionists who Jeremy Corbyn said didn't understand English irony demands an apology from the Labour leader. Rohingya refugees living in Bangladesh have been staging angry protests. They come exactly a year after they were forced from their homes in Myanmar during a military crackdown. Thousands marched in their camps near Cox's Bazar. Our South Asia regional editor Ambar Hassan Ethirajan has more.
Demanding justice, thousands of angry Rohingya refugees marched through camps in Bangladesh's Cox's Bazar district.